Officer Travis Burns, consumed by panic after killing Marcus, quickly realizes the need to hide the body. Spotting an abandoned building, he drags Marcus's lifeless body into his patrol car and speeds to the location. On the roof, Burns shoves the body into a rusty and used water tank, sealing his dark, irreversible act. It was a rainy, cold night in Ridgely, a small town in America that rarely made the news. The dimly lit streets glistened under the occasional flicker of street lights. Officer Travis Burns sat in his patrol car, parked just off the main road, watching the occasional car pass by. Burns had been a police officer for nearly 15 years, but his career was more defined by the fear and division he sowed than by any acts of heroism. Known around town for his harsh treatment of minorities, especially black men, he wore his badge like a shield, protecting him from accountability. That night, Marcus Green was walking home from the local grocery store. Marcus, a 28-year-old black man, was well known in the community for his warm smile and kindness. He had grown up in Ridgely, a town that wasn't always welcoming to people who looked like him, but Marcus had learned to navigate the town's prejudices with quiet grace. With a grocery bag in one hand and his phone in the other, Marcus hurried through the rain, hoping to make it home before the storm intensified. Burns, watching from his car, spotted Marcus and immediately felt his stomach churn with disdain. There was something about the confidence Marcus carried, despite being black, that irritated Burns. He had seen Marcus around before, but tonight, his own festering hatred was ready to boil over. Without a reason or a legitimate call to action, Burns turned on his patrol car's lights and pulled up beside Marcus. Marcus turned, surprised by the flashing lights, and stood still, shielding his eyes from the rain. Burns stepped out of the car, his hand already resting on his holster, and barked, "Hey, where do you think you're going this late?" "Just heading home," Marcus replied, his voice calm but wary. "Is there a problem, officer?" Burns sneered. "Problem? You're the problem. You don't belong out here this time of night. What are you up to?" Marcus frowned. "I just came from the store. I've done nothing wrong." Burns stepped closer, his presence menacing. The rain pelted down harder, making the tension between them almost palpable. "I know you're kind," Burns spat, his voice filled with venom. "Always looking for trouble. Don't think you're too good to be stopped." Marcus, sensing the danger, tried to defuse the situation. "Look, officer, I don't want any trouble. I'm just trying to get home." But it was too late. Burns's mind was made up. He wasn't going to let Marcus walk away so easily. Without warning, he shoved Marcus hard, knocking the grocery bag out of his hand. The items scattered across the wet pavement, but Marcus didn't react. He was used to moments like this, where black men were forced to swallow their pride to avoid violence. "Pick it up," Burns ordered, his voice low and threatening. Marcus didn't move. His hands stayed at his sides, his body rigid with tension. He had dealt with racists his whole life, but this felt different. The hatred in Burns's eyes was raw, burning with an intensity Marcus hadn't seen before. In a sudden, explosive movement, Burns reached for his baton and struck Marcus across the chest. The blow sent him stumbling backward, his breath knocked out of him. Marcus gasped for air, the shock and pain coursing through his body. Burns didn't stop. He hit Marcus again, this time harder. "You think you can just walk away? Think you're better than me?" Burns growled. Marcus tried to shield himself from the blows, but the force of the attack was too much. As Marcus fell to the ground, Burns drew his gun. The rain poured down in torrents, drenching both men. "You should have listened," Burns hissed. And then, with cold precision, he fired. Marcus lay still, his body lifeless on the wet pavement. Burns stood over him, breathing heavily, the gun still smoking in his hand. The rain washed away the blood on the ground, but nothing could wash away what Burns had done. Panic set in. Burns looked around, realizing the magnitude of his crime. He had killed Marcus in cold blood. He couldn't call it in. There would be an investigation, and there was no way he could explain this. He had to hide the body. In the distance, he spotted an old, abandoned building, one that had long been forgotten by most in the town. He had passed by it many times before, and it came to him now as the perfect place to dispose of Marcus. Dragging the body into the alley, Burns lifted Marcus's limp frame into the trunk of his patrol car, then sped off toward the building. When he arrived, the place was deserted, as always. Burns dragged Marcus's body up the stairs, his pulse racing with fear and adrenaline. On the roof, he spotted the old water tank, rusty and unused. With one final effort, Burns shoved Marcus's body into the tank, slamming the lid shut. He stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, as if the rain could wash away the guilt building inside him. But nothing would cleanse his soul of this act. He got back in his patrol car and drove away, the sound of the rain growing louder as he left the scene. The next morning, Marcus's family began to worry. Marcus never missed Sunday breakfast with his mother, and when he didn't show up that morning, alarm bells started to ring. His mother, Mrs. Green, called his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Hours turned into days, and still, no sign of Marcus. His family reported him missing, but for many in the Black community, they knew what that meant: little action from the police. The Greens began organizing their own search efforts, posting flyers around town, pleading for information on Marcus's whereabouts. Friends and family scoured the streets, retracing his usual routes, desperate for any clue. But Ridgely was a small town, and in small towns, silence often masked the worst kinds of secrets. As the days passed, the town's unease grew. People began to talk, whispers spreading through the community. What had happened to Marcus Green? Had he run away? Or was something more sinister at play? Officer Burns carried on as if nothing had happened. He continued his patrols, interacting with his colleagues as usual, but inside, the weight of his actions bore down on him. Every passing day increased his paranoia. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw Marcus's lifeless body floating in that tank. At night, Burns's dreams turned into nightmares. He imagined the sound of footsteps behind him, the cold, accusing stare of Marcus. His life unraveled, but outwardly, he kept up appearances. He went to the local diner, exchanged pleasantries with townsfolk, even attended Marcus's vigil, standing among the grieving community while hiding the truth of what he had done. The discovery of Marcus's body came a week later, when tenants in the abandoned building began to complain about strange smells and foul-tasting water. The complaints prompted the landlord to call in maintenance, and what they found sent shockwaves through Ridgely. When the water tank was opened, the decomposing body of Marcus Green was discovered, floating in the murky water. The town's worst fears had come true. News of the discovery spread like wildfire. The media descended upon Ridgely, turning it into a national spectacle. Reporters stood outside the building, broadcasting the gruesome details to a horrified nation. Marcus's family was devastated, and the Black community, already distrustful of the police, was enraged. But the question that loomed largest was this: who had done it? The investigation kicked into high gear, with the FBI stepping in to assist local authorities. Forensics teams combed through the water tank and surrounding area for evidence, while the media pressured law enforcement to solve the case quickly. In the background, Officer Burns watched, hoping that his crime would remain buried along with Marcus. But he could feel it. His time was running out. The town of Ridgely would never be the same again. The old, dilapidated apartment building had stood on the outskirts of Ridgely for years, forgotten by time and avoided by most residents. It wasn't much, but a few tenants still lived there, clinging to the cheap rent. Over the past week, complaints had piled up: foul smells, strange-tasting water. It was enough to make anyone uneasy, but when maintenance worker Tom Pearson climbed to the roof to investigate, he expected nothing more than a busted pipe or dead animal. The truth was far worse. As he opened the lid of the rusting water tank, Tom recoiled at the stench. The sickening odor of decay hit him like a punch to the gut. Shining his flashlight into the tank, he saw it: a body, swollen and bloated, floating in the murky water. The face was unrecognizable, but the dark skin and the clothes matched the descriptions on the missing posters that had blanketed the town for a week. It was Marcus Green. Tom staggered back, fumbling for his phone. Within minutes, the police were on the scene, soon followed by paramedics, detectives, and the media. As news spread through the town, shockwaves rippled across the community. A young Black man had been found murdered, his body dumped like garbage in a place no one had thought to look. Marcus's family was devastated. His mother, Mrs. Green, collapsed in the arms of relatives when she heard the news. The agony of not knowing where her son was had been unbearable, but the truth of his fate was far worse. The black community, already simmering with distrust toward the police, erupted in outrage. Protests and vigils sprang up overnight, with many demanding answers. Who had killed Marcus and why? As forensic teams began their work, they quickly identified the manner of death. Marcus had been shot in the chest at close range before his body was placed in the water tank. The evidence was clear. This was no accident. It was cold-blooded murder. The FBI, already assisting due to the national attention the case was receiving, began treating the crime as a potential hate crime, given Marcus's race and the nature of his death. Agents combed through the building for evidence, and surveillance footage from nearby streets was pulled to track Marcus's last movements. The pressure was on, and the town was boiling over with tension. But Officer Travis Burns, the man responsible for Marcus's death, tried to act as though nothing had changed. Each day, his guilt gnawed at him, but he maintained his composure in front of his colleagues. He even attended a vigil for Marcus, standing silently as others mourned the young man he had killed. The weight of his crime was becoming unbearable, but Burns convinced himself he had covered his tracks well. With the discovery of Marcus's body, the investigation took a new, urgent direction. Forensic scientists meticulously combed the rooftop and the water tank for any clues that could lead to Marcus's killer. It wasn't long before they found their first significant piece of evidence: a single footprint, half obscured by the rain that had fallen the night Marcus was killed. The tread matched a standard-issue police boot. This was the break they needed. Local authorities and the FBI began narrowing their focus to members of the Ridgely police force. Every officer who had been on duty the night Marcus disappeared was questioned, but none raised immediate suspicion. Burns, however, remained under the radar for the moment, though his guilt weighed heavier each day. Meanwhile, surveillance footage from around the area where Marcus was last seen was thoroughly reviewed. In one grainy clip from a convenience store camera, Marcus was caught on tape just minutes before he disappeared. Behind him, though partially obscured, a familiar vehicle could be seen: Burns's patrol car. It wasn't enough to make an arrest yet, but the noose was tightening around Burns. Detectives began asking tougher questions, looking for inconsistencies in the stories of officers who had been near the scene. Burns, feeling the pressure, maintained his innocence but began to unravel inside. At night, he could barely sleep, haunted by Marcus's face, the sound of his own gun firing, and the knowledge that his days of freedom were numbered. The investigation intensified when a witness came forward, a local resident who had seen a police car speeding away from the abandoned building on the night Marcus was last seen. Though the witness hadn't seen the driver, the description of the car matched that of Burns's patrol vehicle. The final piece of the puzzle came when forensic experts linked the footprint on the roof to Burns's boots. His attempts to cover his tracks had failed. The evidence was clear. Travis Burns was Marcus Green's killer. It was only a matter of time before the walls closed in on Officer Travis Burns. After the footprint matched his boots and the surveillance footage placed him near the scene, detectives finally had enough to bring him in for questioning. Burns had always believed that his position as a police officer would shield him from the consequences of his actions, but now he was beginning to realize the depth of his mistake. When detectives arrived at the station to take him in for questioning, Burns felt the cold sting of fear grip his chest. His heart raced as they led him to the interrogation room. He tried to put on his usual tough facade, but inside, he was unraveling. The interrogation was brutal. The detectives, along with FBI agents, presented him with the evidence they had gathered: the footprint, the witness statement, and the surveillance footage. Burns remained silent at first, stubbornly maintaining his innocence. But as the hours dragged on, the cracks in his armor began to show. "You're looking at life in prison, Burns," one of the agents said. "You think your badge is going to save you now? We know what you did. The evidence is clear. You killed Marcus Green, and you tried to cover it up. This isn't going away." Burns's mind raced. His carefully constructed narrative was collapsing. He thought of the life he'd built, the career he'd relied on for protection, and how it was all crumbling beneath him. He could feel the walls closing in, and the guilt that had been gnawing at him for a week finally broke through. With shaking hands, Burns let out a deep sigh. "It was a mistake," he muttered, his voice cracking. "I didn't mean for it to go that far." The confession tumbled out of him, every detail of the night he shot Marcus and tried to cover up the crime. He told them how he had panicked, how he had dumped Marcus's body in the water tank, hoping it would never be found. But the detectives and agents had no sympathy. Burns had taken a life, and now justice was coming for him. The day Officer Travis Burns was arrested, the entire town of Ridgely seemed to hold its breath. News of his arrest spread like wildfire, igniting even more anger and heartbreak in the community. Burns was escorted from the police station in handcuffs, his head down, avoiding the jeers and protests from those gathered outside. The image of a cop, once untouchable, being taken into custody for the murder of an innocent black man was a stark and painful reminder of the racial tensions simmering in Ridgely and across the country. As Burns was placed in a holding cell, awaiting trial, his world crumbled. The man who had once carried himself with arrogance, believing that his badge could protect him from the consequences of his actions, now faced the full weight of the justice system. The charges against him were severe: first-degree murder, tampering with evidence, and abuse of a corpse. He would soon face a jury, and there would be no escaping the truth this time. The trial garnered national attention, with media outlets covering every detail of the proceedings. It wasn't just a trial about one man's crime. It became a symbol of the deep-rooted issues of racism within the justice system and law enforcement. Civil rights activists, local leaders, and Marcus Green's devastated family all pushed for justice, while some factions of the town still rallied behind Burns, blinded by their prejudice and unwillingness to believe that one of their own could commit such a horrific act. The prosecution built a strong case, laying out the series of events in painstaking detail. They presented the evidence: the footprint matching Burns's police boots, the surveillance footage of his patrol car near the scene, the witness who had seen a police vehicle speeding away from the abandoned building. Most damning of all was Burns's own confession, which the prosecution used to paint a clear picture of a man who had allowed his hatred and racism to drive him to murder. Burns's defense tried to argue that the killing had been a mistake, an act committed in the heat of the moment. They attempted to downplay the racial motivations behind the crime, but the prosecution was relentless, exposing Burns's history of discriminatory behavior on the job and his deep-seated prejudice against black men like Marcus. Throughout the trial, Marcus's family sat in the front row, clinging to each other, silently willing justice to be served. His mother, Mrs. Green, sat with tears in her eyes as the prosecution displayed the final photo of her son, his lifeless body floating in that abandoned water tank. It was an image that had haunted the town and the nation, a symbol of the cruelty and inhumanity that had taken Marcus's life. After weeks of testimony, evidence, and emotional appeals from both sides, the trial came to an end. The jury deliberated for several hours before returning with their verdict. Guilty. Burns stood expressionless as the verdict was read. The weight of his actions finally hit him as he was led out of the courtroom, knowing he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. With the guilty verdict delivered, Officer Travis Burns faced the harshest penalties the law could impose. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The judge, in her sentencing remarks, left no room for doubt about the severity of Burns's crimes. "Your actions were not only a grave violation of the law but a violation of the public trust," the judge said, her voice steady and firm. "As a police officer, you swore to protect and serve your community. Instead, you allowed your hatred and racism to lead you down a path of violence and murder. You brutally took the life of an innocent man, Marcus Green, and attempted to hide your crime in one of the most callous ways imaginable. This court finds your actions reprehensible and unforgivable." The courtroom was silent as the sentence was pronounced. Burns, shackled and wearing an orange jumpsuit, sat motionless as the reality of his fate settled in. Life in prison. No chance for parole. No escape from the punishment he so richly deserved. His badge had shielded him from consequences for years, but now there was nothing left to protect him from the full weight of the law. As he was led out of the courtroom, the sounds of Marcus's family's quiet sobs filled the room. For them, the verdict and sentence offered some small measure of justice, but nothing could bring back the son, brother, and friend they had lost. The legal process wasn't just about holding Burns accountable for his crime. It was also about sending a message. The systemic racism that had allowed Burns to act with impunity for so long was finally being exposed and confronted. The case of Marcus Green became a rallying cry for those seeking police reform and justice for victims of racially motivated violence. In the weeks following the sentencing, Ridgely was a town in flux. Protest continued, as activists and residents called for deeper changes within the police department and local government. The community, still reeling from the tragedy, began to question how such hatred could have been allowed to fester within the ranks of their law enforcement. Burns's sentencing marked a turning point for the town, but the wounds left by his crime and the years of racial tension would take much longer to heal. With Burns locked away, Ridgely tried to move forward, but the scars of the past were still fresh. The town had been shaken to its core by Marcus Green's murder, and the trial had forced residents to confront the uncomfortable truths about race, policing, and justice in their community. For many, it was a wake-up call, a moment to reckon with the deep-seated racism that had long been ignored or brushed aside. The police department, under intense scrutiny, underwent a sweeping internal review. Several officers with histories of misconduct were suspended or fired, and new measures were put in place to ensure that racist behavior within the force would not be tolerated. Mandatory racial sensitivity training was implemented, and the department vowed to build better relationships with the town's Black community. But for Marcus's family and friends, these changes came too late. The Green family, still grieving the loss of their son, found solace in the small justice they had received. Though they could never get Marcus back, knowing that Burns would spend the rest of his life in prison brought some comfort. But they wanted more than just justice for their son. They wanted to ensure that no other family would have to endure the pain they had gone through. In the months after the trial, the Green family founded the Marcus Green Memorial Foundation, dedicated to fighting racial injustice and supporting victims of police brutality. The foundation organized protests, educational programs, and community outreach efforts, working to raise awareness about the impact of systemic racism and the need for reform in law enforcement. The town of Ridgely, once divided by racial tensions, began to heal, though slowly. Many residents came together in the wake of Marcus's death, determined to ensure that his legacy would not be forgotten. Murals were painted in his honor, and his name became a symbol of the fight for justice and equality. For Officer Travis Burns, there would be no redemption. He spent his days in a maximum security prison, living with the knowledge that his actions had not only taken a life, but shattered his own in the process. The hatred that had driven him to murder had ultimately destroyed him. As the years passed, Ridgely changed. The tragedy of Marcus Green became a story told to new generations, a reminder of what could happen when prejudice and unchecked power are allowed to thrive. But it was also a story of hope, of how a community, once torn apart by violence and hatred, could begin to come together to fight for a better, more just future. Marcus Green's name lived on, not as a victim, but as a symbol of resilience and the relentless pursuit of justice. With the sentencing of Officer Travis Burns behind them, the town of Ridgely began a slow and painful process of healing. The tragedy of Marcus Green's death had left deep scars, but it also ignited a transformation within the community. The shock of the crime, committed by a man sworn to protect, forced everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about race, justice, and accountability. It was no longer possible to hide behind ignorance or indifference. Change was the only way forward. The Marcus Green Memorial Foundation became a cornerstone of this new beginning. Established by Marcus's family in his honor, the foundation's mission was clear: to fight racial injustice, hold law enforcement accountable, and offer support to the victims of police brutality. Mrs. Green, once a quiet and reserved woman, became a fierce advocate for reform. Her grief fueled her desire to make sure no other mother had to lose a child to senseless violence. The foundation organized town hall meetings, protests, and educational workshops, focusing on systemic racism and how to dismantle it. They invited speakers from across the country to Ridgely to discuss ways to improve relations between police officers and the communities they served. The events were powerful, drawing large crowds from across the town. People of all races, ages and backgrounds, coming together to listen, learn, and commit to real change. In the Ridgely Police Department, reforms that had once seemed impossible began to take shape. New leadership was brought in to oversee the department, and transparency became a priority. The department instituted body cameras for all officers, mandatory de-escalation training, and stronger accountability measures for misconduct. They also began community outreach programs to rebuild trust, working closely with local Black leaders to understand the community's concerns and needs. The town's transformation wasn't easy. There were still pockets of resistance, people who clung to old prejudices, who resented the changes or believed that Burns had been unfairly targeted. But their voices grew quieter as the town moved forward, determined not to let hatred define its future. For Marcus's family, the grief never fully went away. Mrs. Green often said that while the community was healing, her heart would forever carry the pain of losing her son. But she also found purpose in her work with the foundation, knowing that Marcus's death was not in vain. The foundation's efforts began to make waves beyond Ridgely, drawing attention from neighboring towns and eventually the entire state. Their advocacy work led to the passage of new legislation aimed at curbing police misconduct, ensuring that officers who abused their power would face consequences. Ridgely became a model for other towns grappling with their own histories of racial injustice. The lessons learned from Marcus's tragic death spread far and wide, sparking conversations about race and law enforcement in towns and cities across the nation. Years after Marcus Green's murder, his legacy was stronger than ever. His story had become a symbol of the ongoing fight for justice, equality, and accountability in law enforcement. His name was not forgotten. It was etched in the hearts of the people in Ridgely and beyond. The Marcus Green Memorial Foundation continued to grow, its reach expanding as more people joined the fight. Mrs. Green, now recognized as a leading advocate for justice reform, spoke at national conferences, sharing her story and encouraging others to speak out against racial injustice. The foundation helped fund legal assistance for families of victims of police brutality and established scholarships in Marcus's name to support young Black students pursuing careers in law and social justice. Every year, on the anniversary of Marcus's death, the town held a memorial in his honor. What had once been a day marked by pain and sorrow slowly became a day of reflection and hope. People gathered at the site where Marcus's body was found, but now it was a place of beauty. A mural of Marcus smiling, painted by a local artist, covered the wall of the old building, a testament to the life he had lived and the impact he had left behind. For the community, the mural was more than just a tribute. It was a reminder of how far they had come and how far they still had to go. The work of dismantling racism, of holding people in power accountable, was not over. But Marcus's story had inspired a movement, and the people of Ridgely were committed to seeing it through. In the years following his death, Marcus's story became a national symbol of the fight against racial violence and police brutality. His name was spoken alongside those of other victims, forming a powerful narrative of lives lost too soon but not forgotten. Activists across the country cited Marcus's case as a turning point, a moment when a small town decided to stand up and demand better from its law enforcement, its leaders, and itself. The changes in Ridgely didn't come easily, but they were lasting. The town that had once been divided along racial lines was now a place where open dialogue about race, equality, and justice was encouraged. Schools introduced new curricula that taught students about racial history and systemic injustice. Police officers were now held to a higher standard, and a new generation of officers joined the force with a commitment to protecting all citizens, regardless of their race. As for Officer Travis Burns, he would spend the rest of his life in prison, serving out his sentence for the murder of Marcus Green. His name became synonymous with the dark history of racism in Ridgely, a cautionary tale of what happens when hatred is allowed to fester unchecked. But the town refused to let his actions define them. They chose instead to focus on Marcus's legacy, a legacy of hope, justice, and a brighter future. The final chapter of Marcus Green's story is one of transformation and resilience. His life, though tragically cut short, became a catalyst for change that rippled far beyond the borders of Ridgely. His death forced a reckoning with racism, injustice, and the power dynamics that had allowed men like Travis Burns to act with impunity for so long. In the years to come, The Marcus Green Memorial Foundation would continue to fight for justice, ensuring that Marcus's story was told and retold, so that future generations could learn from the past and build a better, more just society. The mural of Marcus stood as a constant reminder of the importance of standing up to injustice, no matter how deeply entrenched it might be. And so, Ridgely, once a town shadowed by violence and racism, became a symbol of what was possible when a community decided to face its demons and work toward a future where equality and justice were not just ideals, but realities for everyone. Marcus Green's name would never be forgotten. Instead, it would live on as a beacon of hope, reminding all who heard it of the power of truth, justice, and the enduring human spirit.